Guard. Prior to that, I was in the Marine Corps. And then after my California National Guard time, I was in the Oregon National Guard for a little while. Oregon, for the most part, didn't really have any riot issues. There's some other sinister stuff that has happened in Oregon that not well known outside the state, probably never would really have been national news. And of course my military career ended at about the time my unit deployed to New Orleans, and I wasn't invited, and that's when that was actually orchestrated by feds here in Portland who did deploy there. And I have documented proof that the BATF was in New Orleans in September of 2005. And one of the things that happens whenever there's any predictability at all to these events is there's a lot of think tank stuff going on. And I was involved with a few in the 1990s, especially during the interim period during the first Rodney King trial and the second Rodney King trial. And in the course of that, I got to hear some briefings, not just so much about the 92 riots, but the 68 Watch riots, because a lot of the experts at the time had been around for the 68 Watch riots. And that's where we need to say the devil's in the definitions with a lot of this, because the 92 LA riot was riots in tandem going at the same time. On one end we have riots, the other end we have guerrilla warfare operations were being carried out throughout Southern California. What was also reported in the media, dutifully reported in the media, but not fully grasped by the public. The public was still in denial, is that those guerrilla warfare operations reached throughout California. They reached throughout California in a series of arson fires, forest fires that were taking place all the way up to Northern California, including one large one in Truckee, California. Several areas that, even though the predominant racist sounding language in talk radio was all these people burn their own neighborhoods down, the reality was there was a large number of arson fires in predominantly white rural Northern California, including some that were around Lake Tahoe and areas that were targeted specifically by people who felt that they were engaging guerrilla warfare. There was one group that was captured around Truckee. Their pictures were in the news. They were all black. Okay, and then after the one group was caught, not much was discussed after that. What they do know is that these guys they had road tripped from California, from Southern California. They had road tripped north. There was some suspicious activity reports because they were getting gas cans filled. They were going into the backwoods areas and basically lighting forest fires. Now, during that same summer, there was also a series of fires in the hills outside Oakland where there was arson that was traced to a fire equipment supplier. Okay, that was just one or two fires. There were other fires that were actually guerrilla warfare. They were arson. And they were connected with a lot of the arsons that took place in the Los Angeles area, which had very specific military purpose and targets. For example, there was a hit on a firearm wholesaler. I believe it was Bumblebee Wholesale. I had an FFL at the time. I'd done business with some of those people, and I believe it was Bumblebee Wholesale that got hit, and they were kind of hush-hush about that, about what was available before and after. One of the reasons they were hit was that there had been a series of laws enacted in California restricting a list of weapons they considered assault weapons. Now, at the time I had an FFL there, there was also some what they would call loopholes in the law. You could drive a truck through, and many trucks were driven through those loopholes, and a lot of that had to do with renaming of the guns. There was also a number of wholesaler distributors that had the exemptions for dealing with the movie industry and for dealing with law enforcement and government agencies. We also have to remember the Port of Los Angeles and the port facilities there had customs exempt type warehouse situations where, as long as the merchandise and items are being transshipped to another country or to another place, the California law won't apply to those specific secured areas. Those specific secured areas, firearm wholesalers and distributors that were located in California, there were certain nuances of the law which grandfathered them in as law enforcement government suppliers. They were being hit, and then after they were being hit, fires were lit to conceal or obscure the evidence. Now, a lot of that had to do with the old style security systems were not using off-site monitoring. Most of it was on-site, where there would be live security people watching live cameras, and then they would command for recording. It wasn't 24-hour recording with off-site monitoring the way you would want to involve something nowadays. So as soon as people weren't going to work, these places were hit, and then usually there was a fire to mainly somebody was out to burn the video rooms. Okay, the security rooms pretty much housed everything that would have gathered evidence on that. A lot of those are torched. There was a government operation that went in. It was, I believe it was run by Army Intelligence, that went in very early in the riots. These guys pull up in a semi-truck that looks like any other semi-truck. One of the things this piece of equipment will do, and it had like, you know, half dozen people staffing it, is they record all radio traffic within range of this truck. And what it's going to do is it's going to record all the cell phone traffic, all the pager traffic, all the two-way radio traffic. One of the things they discovered was that a lot of these attacks were very specifically carried out with high levels of precision. There was a dry cleaner that had a large supply of police uniforms that had been hit. There had been attempts to hit some military supply points, but most of those are outside the city. They're outside the city, and to a large degree they're pretty well guarded, or they're remote enough that a few guard units in specific locations can cover a large area. Those are going to be around, let's say, Camp Roberts, where Navy SEALs would train, and they're bunkers for those supplies and all that kind of stuff, pretty well protected. And so, as far as we were told, those were not being hit, but we also know they weren't asking for any additional volunteers to secure those areas. There was a fair amount of distrust of the National Guard. Those who were deployed in the '92 riots were issued only 5 rounds per man. Now, there were veterans of 68 Watch riots who gave some briefings and some talks about what was going on. 68 Watch riots, different groups handled things very differently. There were operations where they cordoned off areas, they cut power, they cut phone lines, and remember, there wasn't much for two-way radios or anything in use by the Black Panthers at the time. But one of the strong indicators that a death squad would be in operation is that power and phone lines have been cut, and then hunter-killer teams would move in and assassinate pre-targeted individuals, usually at pre-targeted safe houses. What I've been trying to get at is the fact there is a difference between guerrilla warfare and riot, the spontaneous type riots. And what can happen when specific types of groups are coordinating these things is they're going to happen in parallel, they're going to happen in tandem, where a lot of times, like I mentioned, there was that intelligence unit that had moved into Los Angeles to record cell phone radio traffic, pager traffic, things like that. They found that there were phone conversations, even radio, two-way radios, that were going back and forth. And remember, there weren't that many cell phones then compared to now. So there was a lot of information going back and forth, where somebody would say, you got a riot over at one place so that we can loot another place. There were smaller groups that were doing highly coordinated attacks and looting on high-value targets. It was one of the reasons why National Guard was sent in to guard gun shops. A lot of gun shop owners went in, and there was no conflict over the closing of the gun shops. Everybody kind of understood why. These places were getting hit, and that was where the National Guardsmen ended up with more than 5 rounds per man, was because the gun shop owners were handing out the ammo. There was one major gunfight where somebody kept repeatedly trying to take down one of the gun shops. And later on, they figured out that the guy leading the attack, I think, was a former El Salvadoran soldier who had aligned himself with one of the Hispanic gangs. And but this was before we ever heard of MS. This is before MS-13 was even on the map. So it was some other smaller gang. But the guy was apparently the equivalent of a ranger, and he repeatedly tried to take down this gun shop. It was kind of a prolonged battle, and eventually reached a point where he tried to charge through the front doors with a vehicle or something like that. Got shot trying to charge through with a vehicle or something. But the guy was a military veteran, okay, of El Salvadoran military. They're competent military. And people get out. They do their time. They get out. And they're out there. Their skills may not have fully, they may not diminish. Their fighting spirit may not diminish, and when they go into other lines of work and other circles of friends. So in that aspect, we saw that guerrilla warfare in tandem to the riots, and sometimes coordinated with it. And so, I guess the earlier segment was controversial enough that Google may not allow that to go through. I notice that the censoring thing it's like still under review or under editing. Well, we know the electronics only take a few minutes for this. I think we're getting into a half hour since the upload. It's not getting approved. The advice that I gave to the Oath Keepers in Ferguson, when it looked like for certain there's confirmation, there's people that organize these things had moved in. And what's interesting is a lot of them were from Baltimore. But the other thing is, the cause in these new generation of riots is usually much more severe and righteous than in the Rodney King. In the Rodney King thing, it was a beating. Okay, we understand a beating. We also understand if you got a problem with the police and you take it up with the police, we're all going to understand why. If you got a problem with the police and you raid and loot electronics stores, it doesn't look like it's for the cause. Okay, it looks like somebody's just found an opportunity to commit a bunch of crimes. And when we look at some pretty blatant killings in the street, gee whiz, that's kind of like between the people and the police there. And that's why I would tell outside people going in, conduct security operations on areas that have a high human resource value, where there's people in danger, where there's any, protecting the innocent, protecting, being that citizen soldier, that citizen defender type person. That's going to work. When you're talking about defending, and I'm not into having a war against the rich or loot the rich. I'm definitely not with that. But when you're talking about defending high value targets, where they are part and parcel of the beneficiaries of an economic and social system in a particular area, they need to be paying for security. Okay, and if their clientele is not happy with prices being adjusted by the fact that they're paying for security, well, maybe they need to have an examination of how this whole thing is working. Because there's a reason why they're the elite. There might be a reason why people hate them for being the elite. And it doesn't mean that our blood is worth minimum wage to go and protect their status. Okay? And that's one of the big issues that I've taken with the people who had such high criticisms of the Iraq war contractors as far as the pay goes. Now, as far as the behavior goes, some of those guys are behaving pretty badly. But when you look at the amount of money that those same firms will spend on attorneys who probably won't go home dead at the end of the day, even if they do the job badly, attorneys go home and attorneys make $300, $500, $600 a day. I mean, that's normal for a lot of attorneys when they're on the job. And then when they're on the job and doing overtime, attorneys make that kind of money. A lot of these guys were thinking that $25 an hour is good money. I had to explain to some of these people, hey, listen, any skilled carpenter, electrician, or plumber in that time period would get about that. Okay, a skilled carpenter, electrician, or plumber in the early 2000s was easily going to get his $30 an hour. And under those circumstances, where there's a lot of overtime, there's a hard environment, the union rates go up. And what's interesting is when the liberals have such a high criticism of armed professionals making a union rate of pay, especially in a military sector and a paramilitary sector. Well, they've already established that they're law enforcement people who the liberals now control most big city law enforcement agencies, and they control most of the agencies that get sheriffs elected. They don't have a problem with those guys making a family wage income. But they do have a problem with a lot of soldiers and former soldiers making a family wage income. Take note with that. Take note where those attitudes are coming from. They come from the attitude that the gunman is cannon fodder. Okay, that your life is worth less, therefore that's your job. In that respect, when you're talking about highly skilled individuals, if they want those skill levels and those skill sets for higher end security, you've got to pay for the higher end security equipment and training, and the people are competent to do that. Okay, the 400-pound fat lady with a tactical vest and a two-way radio is not it. Okay, and so under those circumstances, the elite in a given area need to be looking at private security that they pay for. Now, as far as groups doing volunteer security and things for, let's say, for expenses, the way the Oath Keepers would do things, at least for basic expenses, that's a case-by-case basis. And in a volunteer basis like that, I think you need to look at the totality of the circumstances rather than nitpicking the legal standards on who should or should not be a security guy. On the other hand, we also have to look at the fact that you still need to have some sort of a professional training or background. Maybe they were certified, but the certification has expired, and something to that level. When we talk about what kind of weapons they bring into the game, sure, combat arms are going to matter in a guerrilla warfare scenario. It's just that you need to be able to have an option for those lower level threat profiles that are going to happen in the spontaneous fight riot type situation, so that your use of force doesn't make the matter worse. And that's going to have a lot to do with the advice I would give on a case by case if I were perhaps called to consult or supervise in a particular situation.